This is episode 107 of the Trauma Coaching for Latter-day Saints podcast. What's my responsibility with trauma? I'm your host, Anita Bremer. I'm a Latter-day Saint mom with a history of trauma. I use my own life experience and spiritual gifts, as well as mindset and somatic tools to help you trade ashes for beauty and end generational trauma. Let's talk about what it takes to truly heal and find lasting joy from the perspective of your nervous systems. Okay, so I've had several situations that told me that this topic was needed today. So we're just going to jump right in. I want you to imagine that you start making dinner and you realize you have an ingredient missing that's very important. So you get in the car and you start driving to the store and you get in a car accident. Somebody comes along and they hit your car. You're totally not at fault. They're 100% at fault. And you break your arm in the car accident. Who is responsible for your broken arm or for healing your arm? Now, I like using this analogy because the other driver who was at fault for the car accident is responsible for paying for the damages to your car, for sure. But he or she would not be able to heal your broken arm. You would have to do that, right? And your body would heal with support, right? And I love this analogy because when we're thinking about trauma, most of the time at least, there seems to be one or more people involved that maybe created the trauma. Not always, but sometimes, right? When we think about situations like war, the person who started the war, who instigated the war, maybe we would say is responsible for all the soldiers and their injuries and all of that. Now, we don't normally think of it that way because we enter a war when we feel threatened. And we understand that there will be certain sacrifices to be made that our military, those that go and fight, they could get hurt or they could die, right? Which is why that is such an amazing thing that people do to join the military, to be willing to fight at war. But if we were to ask the question, who is responsible for your wartime injuries? We would point to a certain person or a certain country or something like that, right? If someone is sexually abused, we point to a person, we point to the abuser, right? Now, there's a difference between a person or a people being at fault or to blame for something happening, like a car accident, and being responsible, right? And there's also a difference between, in the analogy of the car accident, between the car's damage and the damage to a body, a bodily injury, right? Because if I hit your car, I can pay for your car to be replaced or to be fixed, right? But I can't, there's no amount of money that I can pay for your arm to be healed. Now, I can pay for the doctor's services, but even the doctor himself or herself can't heal your arm, right? They can put your arm in a cast, they can give you medicine, they can give you exercises to do, right? They can give you support and resources, but they can't heal your arm. Now, so that part, the healing, has to be up to the individual. And I think this is such an interesting analogy too, because even the individual with the broken arm can't really heal the arm, right? It's not like we wave a magic wand and be like, arm is fixed, no more broken bone. all we can do is give the arm support. We could eat healthy so that our bodies have the nutrients, the vitamins that it needs to heal an arm. But really, our bodies know how to heal. When we get a cut on our finger, our bodies heal that. It heals naturally most of the time, right? Unless we get an infection or something like that. So, when we're talking about trauma, we are talking about biological, physiological, and emotional wounds that can only be healed by the individual that is experiencing them. And the individual can't even really, do something specific. I mean, there are things that can be done, but the individual, just like I can't heal my own arm, the individual just has to give themselves the time, the space, the resources for the body to do the healing. So, when we talk about trauma and we are looking at responsibility, it's kind of a nuanced topic, right? Because I might have been sexually abused and that could have been traumatic for me and caused some lasting effects. But my abuser can't heal me. I have to do the work to heal, right? So there is work involved in seeking out and creating an environment of support. Right? So the body itself does the healing when it has the support it needs. But the perpetrator or the agent, I should say, that's probably the most neutral term, the agent of the trauma, the person who creates the trauma really can't be the person that heals the trauma unless you are traumatizing yourself, right? That's a totally different topic. Most of the time, when we think about trauma, trauma happens in some kind of relationship. Now, have I done an episode on big T versus little t trauma? I can't even remember now. This is what happens when you're at 107 episodes. They all start to blur together. Just a little recap about capital T versus small t trauma. The word trauma has a specific connotation, and it came from the actual word trauma is either Latin or Greek, I don't remember, and it means wound. And at first, when the word trauma was first used, it was talking about physical wounds to our bodies, right? And then it got sort of co-opted into the psychology realm. And it first started out when psychiatrists, psychologists were working with war veterans. And the war veterans were having what we now call, PTSD, these flashbacks or these remnants of things that would happen to them, even though, and it would feel like they were in the war still, memories or whatever, what have you. They were working with these veterans and they coined the term post-traumatic stress disorder. And over time, so that was kind of, I think, back in the 1930s or 40s, over time, that word trauma has sort of morphed and changed. And the definition isn't super clear, or it kind of depends on who you're talking to. But these capital T traumas are generally, the capital T is when there's this big event, right? Like 9/11 or a car accident or a rape or something like that, where it's a time-defined event that most of the world, most people in the world would agree, yes, that will affect you physically, emotionally, psychologically. All right, so that's capital T. Lowercase t trauma are those sort of everyday kind of things that happen to us that don't seem big on the outside necessarily, but that really affect us, right? And so, one of my sort of layman's definition of trauma is stuck emotion. So, when something happens to us, even if it is a physical trauma, usually, unless we're unconscious or, some other extenuating circumstances, it is it happens with lots of negative emotion, right? So maybe we get scared or we get overwhelmed or something like that. And the emotion of the experience, what happens on the inside of us, affects our biology, right? It affects us. It leaves this kind of imprint on us. And so often now, experts are talking about trauma in terms of it's not what happens on the outside, but what happens on the inside when something happens on the outside, right? And the reason I bring this up is because in most cases, and there are some rare cases where this might not be true. Most cases, this involves more than one person, right? Like you could get in a car accident and it is your fault and you sustain damage or whatever, and that could be traumatic for sure. So there are times when trauma can happen with just one person. But most of the time, because most of the time in our world, things happen in relationship, there's kind of a victim and a villain, right? There's the villain who's the bad guy, the one who caused the trauma. And then I'm just putting us individually in the victim seat as the one who had the trauma happen to us, right? We're the one that the trauma is in us. And most of the time, the victim has to be the one to take responsibility for their own healing, right? So kind of made this distinction like you can't really like force the healing. There's not like something you can do, but you can support yourself, support your body in healing. And most of the time, the villain, the person perpetrating the trauma, isn't going to take responsibility for it, right? Sometimes they might apologize or ask for forgiveness or what can I do? But there aren't always things to do, right? There aren't always actions we can take short of being able to pay for something that has been damaged. But if your body is the thing that has been damaged or your psychology is the thing that has been damaged, we can't pay to have that fixed. We can only pay for support in the healing of it. Okay. So, one thing I notice as I work with my clients is sometimes I have clients who are resistant to taking responsibility for their own healing. And this kind of comes on a gradient, right? I mean, obviously, people wouldn't hire me if they didn't want to create some kind of change or healing in their lives. So just hiring someone is a step in the right direction to taking responsibility. But sometimes I notice people get stuck in this sort of mindset of, and I wonder if it's actually related to learned helplessness, but this mindset of like, I can't heal myself. Somebody else has to do it. My husband has to do it, or my kids have to help me, or my neighbors have to help me. Like I'm so far gone. I'm so damaged that I can't fully heal. And first of all, I just kind of want to say that that's BS. There is always hope. Always. I believe in a God that is all powerful and all knowing and can make all wrongs right. Pretty sure I've talked about that on the podcast before. But there becomes a point where you seek for help and maybe you kind of go through the motions, but you actually don't believe that you can change or that you're capable of creating change or healing in yourself. And the reason why I really wanted to talk about this is because I wanted to just point out that if you feel like a victim, if you feel helpless, if you feel like you're pitying yourself, if you feel like you can't, like there's something preventing you, it's the fabric of your being, just you're just not smart enough or not capable enough. I really want you to hear the message that you're wrong. Okay. Now, I also want to make this little caveat that when we are victims of abuse, we do not need to take responsibility for the abuse. So there's a difference between responsibility or blame or fault or whatever you want to call it of the abuse being perpetrated and responsibility for the healing, right? Now, you are responsible for your own healing, but you aren't responsible for the abuse, right? So if you are a victim of abuse, be it verbal abuse, emotional abuse, did you know that when a person uses their size to intimidate you, that can be considered abuse? There's lots of different kinds of abuse, sexual abuse, any time where you feel like you don't have full agency. Well, I hesitate here. I'm like, is that true? Is any time where you don't feel like you have full agency, could that be considered abuse? I want to lean toward yes. When you don't have full agency and someone else is harming you, or even a situation is harming you, right? Because we could think about systems of oppression. That is abusive. It is abuse. You are not responsible for the abuse, which sometimes my clients want to rationalize. Well, I played a part in it and I could have done this or I could have done that. And if you were to talk to a 5-year-old who was sexually abused, and the 5-year-old told you, well, I could have stayed away from them, or I could have said this, or I could have said that, but I didn't. There would be no part of you that would say, like, you're right, 5-year-old. You do have a part in taking responsibility for that abuse. No. When you are the victim of abuse, it is never your responsibility, to make amends for the abuser or to justify or rationalize the abuse. We often want to do it because we want to make sense of the world, but that is not your responsibility as the victim. Now, you want to heal from that abuse? That's your responsibility. And for something to change, you have to change something. Most of my clients are in their 40s or 50s, and they've been doing kind of the same patterns of living over and over again. And yeah, maybe we try this or we try that, but mostly we just stay with the same patterns, right? So if you want something to change, you have to change something. You have to change the way you are in relationship with yourself, with the people around you, with how you think about yourself, how you think about the situation, right? Like you have to change. Nothing is going to change if nothing changes. I know that seems so obvious, but it's not. It really isn't. We think we're changing, but if we're not deciding, this is me, I'm the one that has to heal, nobody is going to come rescue me, then we might be still stuck in a pattern of looking outside of us for the answers, for what to do, what to say, how to do it, right? And some of that can be helpful, but we have to get to the point where it's like, it's me. I'm the one that has to change this. Now, that can feel like a burden, like, oh, another thing I have to do. You don't have to change anything. That's something that's really important to recognize you can keep living your life with the effects of the trauma if you want. Nobody's going to blame you. I totally get it. I'm like, dang, it's hard to change. It takes a lot of energy, takes a lot of attention, like takes time, right? Like if you come to me and you're like, I don't know if I actually want to heal from this trauma, I'd be like, yeah, I get that. You don't have to. But if you want to, if you want a different experience, if you want to feel different, no coach or therapist or friend or spouse or any other person in the world, nobody can do it for you. The only thing we can do is offer support and resources, right? That's a really important distinction to make. The coach is not there to save you or to fix you. The therapist is not there to fix you. We kind of want them to, right? Because that would be so much easier. You have to be the one. Sometimes it feels really empowering, right? If it's my responsibility to heal myself, then I'm the only one. Nothing is in my way. Right? I want to encourage you to think of it more as an empowerment and less as a burden. But maybe you can't get there yet, and that's fine. I also wanted to talk about the difference between fault or blame and the capacity to have your needs met. So sometimes when we talk about trauma, this is related to attachment. And our trauma wounds oftentimes start with our attachment wounds. And by attachment, what I mean is how we were in relationship with our first caregivers, usually our mother and father, but not always, right? If you're adopted, then your first caregiver would be your birth mother, but then your first caregivers would be your adopted parents, right? So if we're able to create a strong connection with our first caregivers, particularly our mothers, because we lived in our mother's wombs, so we kind of were our mothers for a long time. If we're able to create a strong, solid, consistent relationship, connection with them, then our attachment will be secure. But if we aren't, then sometimes our attachment is insecure or sometimes it's anxious or whatever. There's different words for this. And that can create trauma because our first resource, our first support system is our caregiver. When we're born, there's no way for us to regulate ourselves or meet our own needs. So we need a lot of support and resources from people outside of us. So the idea of trauma and nervous system regulation is highly informed by how we were able to connect with our first caregivers. Okay. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, my needs were not met as a young infant, a young child. It would be easy for me to turn around and blame my mother, be like, it's because of you, or my father, it's because of you that I have this trauma, that I could never speak up for myself, that I always feel like I'm walking on eggshells, that I always have tension in my body, right? I could blame them, and I have. But here's a really important distinction. They didn't have capacity to meet my needs because they also had trauma. They also had attachment wounds, right? So then, is it their fault? Should I blame them? If I didn't have my needs met, but my first caregivers, my parents, my mom and dad, didn't have the capacity to meet my needs, is it their fault? I find it very helpful to separate the idea of responsibility from the idea of blame, because now I know that my first caregivers didn't have the capacity to really attune and take care of a little baby infant and give her the needs that she had, fulfill her needs, right? And so it kind of is like, oh, well, they couldn't do it. Oh, that's interesting. So then I don't want to blame them, right? And we can take it all the way up the generations, right? Because they didn't have capacity, because their parents didn't have capacity, because their parents didn't have capacity. And there's lots of, worldwide traumas that happened that then people use drugs and alcohol to cope. And so it's like this compound trauma effect, right? But for me, it doesn't feel good to blame my parents. And to be honest, for a long time, I was like, why am I not angry at them? Why don't I want to blame them? I should want to blame them. But it just didn't feel good because you know what? I still love them. I miss them. Right. So it felt in conflict with the part of me that wanted to love my parents, that wanted to appreciate all that they tried to do. And when a mentor told me that just because my needs weren't met doesn't mean that I had to blame my parents because they didn't have the capacity to meet my needs, it was like a relief, like, oh, I still get to love them. Now, everyone's going to come at this a different way. You might want to be mad at your parents. You might want to blame them. And maybe that's part of your process of healing. That's okay. But you don't have to if you don't want to. If you feel like social anxiety or just anxiety in general, it's the same thing, right? When when we are kind of scared of social situations, oftentimes, most of the time, is because we think the other people will reject us, right? Or some version of that. And what that really is saying is that I am waiting for somebody outside of me to meet my needs. And I can't meet my needs on my own, or I'm unwilling to. And so it's related because this is the part where I say, nobody's going to come save you. Nobody's going to come meet your needs exactly the way you need them to be met. You have to be the one. You have to be the one to notice what you need and fulfill that need. Right. So I had a client recently. We were talking about this, and I was telling her that, like, she needed to take responsibility. Like, she's not going to change if she isn't the one to change something. And then she said, well, what about social anxiety? Like, I don't feel like I can go do the things I want to do because I'm scared. And I said, yeah, that's the same thing, right? You're scared because you're still waiting for someone else to take responsibility for your needs. Just kind of wanted to loop that part of the conversation in. So I'm going to drop a link in the show notes about this drama triangle that I'm about to talk about. But studies, or in psychology, you can read the Wikipedia article about it. Throughout the decades, they've come up with this triangle, which somebody coined as the drama triangle. There's a victim, there's a villain, and there's a mentor. We could see this in like movies, right? There's always a villain, a bad guy, and there's oftentimes a victim that becomes a hero, but I'm just going to call it the hero. And then there's some kind of teacher or mentor, right? So in Harry Potter, Harry is the victim, Voldemort is the villain, and Dumbledore is the mentor. In Star Wars, we've got Obi-Wan Kenobi is the mentor. Darth Vader is the villain, right? And then depending on which movie, there's a hero there. And it's easy for us to see ourselves in this drama triangle, right? When we make ourselves the victim and we're like, oh, poor me, and I can't, then there has to be a villain. And oftentimes, in order to get out of that victim villain dynamic, we have to bring in an outside third party, like a coach or just somebody else to be the mentor or the teacher or the coach. And this article, I thought it was really interesting, said in order to get out of this dynamic, this drama triangle, the victim is encouraged to become a creator, right? To look at the outcomes instead of the problems, to take responsibility for choosing their response to life challenges, right? Isn't that so good, right? So you can immediately step out of being a victim by considering yourself a creator, by focusing on solutions instead of problems, and by taking responsibility for your response to life challenges. And you can think of the quote unquote villain, instead of thinking of them as the villain or the persecutor, and that could be a person or a situation, think of it as the challenger, right? So with the movies, we always need a challenge, something that develops our muscles, helps us change from one person to the next, right? At the beginning of the movie, it's the victim. At the end of the movie, it's the hero, right? So if you think of the other person or the situation that feels like it's persecuting you, what if it's just challenging you? What if it's forcing you to clarify your needs and to focus on your learning and growth, to focus on a possible solution instead of just the problem, right? And then the third person, the outside person, the coach, oftentimes in the beginning is a rescuer, right? So when we're in victim villain mentality, there's somebody that comes in, swoops in, and rescues. But we don't really want to be rescued because then it disables us from being able to learn and grow and become. So we want to think of the rescuer now as the mentor or the coach, right? The person who asks questions to help you make informed choices. The person who sees you as a creator, as capable of change. The person who sees you as able to come up with your own solutions, right? To take positive action. Right? Isn't that so fascinating? So we turn the victim to the creator, the villain to the challenger, and the rescuer to the coach or the mentor. I kind of like the word mentor, right? So Harry Potter was the victim. His adopted family was really mean to him. Sorry, this if you haven't watched or read Harry Potter, you've had your time. I'm going to give spoilers. He goes to school, he's bullied, right? He's like, poor Harry Potter, the kid who lost his parents, and everyone's whispering about him, right? But in the end, Harry Potter becomes the hero, right? And he didn't have anyone to come rescue him, which was part of the tension of the storyline. Like, why doesn't somebody step in, right? Why doesn't somebody do something? Instead, he had his two friends, Ron and Hermione, who gave him support, right? And he had Dumbledore. He had Dumbledore, who eventually became a close mentor, a teacher, who kind of guided him in the right direction. Right. And we have Voldemort, who, if we think of Voldemort as the villain, he's the bad guy, we should all be scared of him. Then it's easy to put ourselves in the victim position. But if we think of Voldemort as the challenger, Voldemort is the situation that makes Harry Potter change into a hero. Then it's kind of like, oh, I don't have to be scared of that. I can welcome that in. I can get creative with finding solutions, right? So that's what I hope for you if you've been feeling like a victim to your circumstances, to the traumatic things that have happened in your life, for you to really start thinking of yourself as a creator and to start thinking of the situation or the person as the challenger and to bring an outside person in, because when it's just the victim and the villain, it's just a line between them. It can get very unstable very quickly. But if there's a victim and a villain and an outside person, the coach, the mentor, then it's a triangle, which is very stable. So I want you to think about who can be that outside person that can come and coach me, not rescue me, but can come and give me support, encourage me to ask the right questions, to find solutions, um, that can see me as a creator, that can see me as totally able and capable of finding my way out of this, right? Now, I would invite you to consider me as your coach, but it doesn't have to be me. I just want the world to heal. So it could be somebody in your sphere of influence, somebody that you're close to. And I just encourage you to make those changes, because in order for something to change, you have to change something. Okay, journaling questions for this episode. The first one is, how am I not taking responsibility for my own healing? And the second one is, how can I think of myself as a creator? What resources do you have? Um, what evidence do you already have that you're a creator? Come to drop in coaching on Wednesday, December 14th at 2 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. That is a change from the original schedule. And I wanted to let you know that I recently sat down and set my goals for 2023. And I realized that I only have 2 spots for private coaching available. And my packages are 6 months or 12 months. So openings don't happen very often. So if you have been thinking about possibly hiring me in the future, I just want to encourage you to come do a free session with me and see if it feels right, see if the timing is right for you. I am going to be doing a group offer next year, so stay tuned for more details about that. But that's enough for now, and so are you. The impact I am making in the world grows best by word of mouth. Would you please share this episode with someone this week? And if you're ready to address your own trauma with my support, go to danitabrummer.com to schedule a free trauma assessment call. Until next time, go be yourself and follow the spirit.